12 more bodies have been exhumed at the mass grave site in Shakahola Forest, Kilifi County, raising the death toll to 403. Police in Kenya are in the fourth phase of exhumation in the ongoing probe into a cult whose members are said to have starved themselves in order to meet Jesus. Followers of preacher Paul Mackenzie were buried in the forest located in Chakama Ranch.
Coast Regional Commander Rhoda Onyancha told reporters that so far, 95 people have been rescued while 258 DNA samples have been collected, but no new arrests have been made in connection with the deaths. Thus, the total number of arrests remain 37. Joining us this morning from Nairobi, Kenya is multimedia journalist Raquel Muigai. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Olive and Osariji, for having me.
All right, Raquel, let's talk about how the Kenyan government has, handled these investigations. So far, we've had discovery of over 400 dead persons in the Shakahola Forest on Pastor Paul Mackenzie's property. Would you say that the people of Kenya are satisfied with how the government has been handling it so far, or is there more that could have been done?
So far, so good. That's what we can say. Earlier on, there were issues regarding the coverage of this particular incident, but at least at this point, the government has tied or rather reduced that push that they had, and therefore they're allowing journalists to also visit the place and also just allowing that free flow of information. So yesterday they had exhumed 16 bodies, at least 16 bodies, so bringing that total to 419 bodies that have so far been exhumed. And just as you've mentioned earlier, it's in the phase 4. Hopefully by the end of this week, they get to halt that exercise and allow for autopsy examination to be conducted on the bodies that have been exhumed so far. But what we can say at the moment is that the government is doing what it can at this point. And, the investigation officers are also trying to pile up their evidence to allow and to just close whatever gaps that they exist to prevent the different scenarios that have been there previously, where Pastor Paul Mackenzie has been arrested, not once, not twice, and then released thereafter. So based on the information that we're getting from the ground at this point is that by August, the investigations officer will be closing up and winding up, and therefore hopefully get to officially charge Pastor Paul Mackenzie and also know the fate of the 37 people who have been arrested together with him.
Okay, well, Lands and Fiscal Planning Principal Secretary General Nixon Corey said that there are no records that even show that Preacher Paul Mackenzie owns the 800 acres in Shakahola where his church was situated. And let's also talk about how that went unnoticed, especially considering how popular that he was.
It's actually true. Mackenzie does not own this land because he has no title deed for this land. This land belongs to the Chakama Ranching Limited, and the directors actually came out earlier, some few weeks ago, stating that they do have title deed for this land, and so this is the narration that they did give. In the 1980s, they bought 100,000 acres of this land within the Shakahola Forest, and by the 1990s, the government set out to buy half of that acres that they had. To settle the squatters within that area. So the other half remained under their ownership. But when Pastor Paul Mackenzie reached out and went out on his own business trying to figure out where to set up his next church, he met the squatters who told him that they were born and bred there, and therefore they sold this other half of the land without Mackenzie knowing that it actually had owners, real owners, who had the title deed. But the directors also claimed that they did make a report in 2021 or 2020 regarding Pastor Paul Mackenzie encroaching on that land at a nearby police station, but no action was taken. And that is where questions arise on how this could have happened without Pastor Paul Mackenzie being noticed or some of his activities being noticed, because earlier on, the Interior Cabinet Secretary, Kithure Kindiki, had appeared before the Senate Ad Hoc Committee and mentioned that despite the fact that Pastor Paul Mackenzie was on government radar based on his previous arrests, they also don't know how this escaped the intelligence, the government intelligence. And therefore, these are some of the questions that are being asked. There was a report made. There is an OB number that was reported that provides proof and provides evidence that actually the Chakama Ranch directors did report about Pastor Paul Mackenzie's encroachment, but nothing was done. So that actually does not belong to Pastor Paul Mackenzie. Yeah.
Let's talk about the steps that churches in Kenya, including Pastor Paul Mackenzie's congregation, what steps are they taking in cooperating with law enforcement and supporting the affected families during this tragic incident? And has this in some way, affected how church is being run in Kenya?
To be honest, Olive, I don't think it has affected how churches are being conducted in Kenya, because Kenya is largely a religious nation. There are at least 4,000 churches, and therefore this is not the first time that we're seeing a rogue pastor come and go. They have come so many and gone away as well. But so far at this point, what we can say is that out of these 37 people who have been arrested, some of them are his congregants, some of them are people who knew him, and they were his followers, and therefore they will be helping and aiding the investigation officers collect more evidence on the kind of statements that they provide. But the churches have come out to strongly condemn what Pastor Paul Mackenzie, because there have been a lot of accusation fingers being thrown at different entities, and especially the government, by the churches in Kenya, and even the religious leaders who state that this would not have happened if the government had stringent laws that had tamed the mushrooming of churches. Because time and time again, you get to see churches mushrooming. You might have a residential area within probably where I stay, and within 200 meters or 300 meters, there are like 3 different churches there. So there is no law actually that tames the mushrooming of churches or looks at the registration of churches, looking at and comparing this law with how our neighboring country, Rwanda, has done it. And so this is what the churches in Kenya and religious leaders are calling for, that the government should somehow look into how this can be tamed, but also calling upon the public to also not allow themselves to be easily gullible to some of these pastors who have quite mischievous ways of spreading their religious propaganda in the country.
What we see sometimes is that even when there are rogue pastors that come out, they still gain massive support from their followers. Is this the case with Pastor Paul Mackenzie's church?
Exactly. And the funny thing is that when some of these rogue pastors come, you'll always talk about the people who are gullible are those who are not probably well educated, well informed. But for Pastor Paul Mackenzie, this actually wasn't the case. You do have a number of individuals who followed him that had the best jobs that you can think of. I mean, people who had jobs internationally in different companies. It reminds me of the story of this lady who was working for one of the best airlines in the world, and you wonder what will push someone to sell whatever it is that they had to come and follow Pastor Paul Mackenzie in order for them to see Jesus, to starve themselves. And therefore, sometimes it's also hard to look at how radicalization happens, but it also depends on the kind of social networks that someone puts, the kind of discontent that probably someone has, and what Pastor Paul Mackenzie was actually offering to them. Because up until this point, it does not make any sense to anyone else on how you can starve yourself and deny yourself every little thing, and it's including, in fact, meals to die so that you can see Jesus. We have a mother who left his husband and went to the forest with 6 of her children. All of them died in the forest. She was rescued, but even the husband comes out and says, if she meets with this woman, she will therefore have to just finish her as it may. And therefore, these are some of the situations that the country is dealing with, the investigation officers are dealing with, on just trying to grasp, how did this happen?
Raquel,
how did it escape the government's eye? At the very least.
I want you to, before we wrap up, I want you to also quickly speak on, if there are other details about this, because, it's hard for the average person to believe that 400 people decided to stop eating food until they died because they're trying to see Jesus. I understand the idea of radicalization, but it's just hard. And, because, of course, a lot of these bodies were buried, it means that, it didn't, someone actually did help them commit suicide, if they did commit suicide, or at least, there's just so much that needs to be uncovered. Who buried them in the first place? So these are questions that need to be asked. So help us understand if there are other aspects of it that we are still not talking about. And I think what Olive was trying to ask is, the members of the church, are they still in support of Pastor Paul Mackenzie, even after seeing what's happened?
Yes, and that's true. There are some members who, even in custody, are still denying themselves to eat. We've had one who died in custody, and his followers have still remained his followers up until this point. But one thing that came out very clearly, especially during the early weeks of the investigations, when the first 100 or 200 bodies were being exhumed, is that the autopsy report revealed that some of them had actually been assisted, or rather had been killed. They did not die of natural causes from the kind of denial that we're talking about, but there were some instances in which the autopsy, the medical examiner believes that actually these people were killed. So it's upon the investigation officers to identify who exactly was enabling Pastor Paul Mackenzie to commit these crimes, because that clearly shows that it's murder. But it's baffling, to say the least, as you say, Osariji, that even at this point, there are those who still believe that Pastor Paul Mackenzie is doing, or has done his best. He is the best follower they had. And you really can't tell them anything different, because for them, what Pastor Paul Mackenzie said is what stands.
Really, really, really heartbreaking. I can't even explain it further. Olive?
Yeah, it's like very terribly heartbreaking. Is there any justice, really? Now we know that these lives cannot come back. Unfortunately, some of them are still being brainwashed, even whilst in custody. He has such a stronghold over their minds. But how can we ensure a fair trial and justice for the victims and their families? Do we trust, that the judiciary is going to be able to ensure that this happens, considering that he had been operating for over 2 decades and was able to evade justice twice?
Yeah, and that's true. I think it's a question that everyone in the country has. But personally, from where I sit, I think the best thing that happened to this particular case is the fact that it has elicited public interest. Looking at just the history of some of the cases in the country that we've had that has elicited this kind of interest, not just in the country and not just from different organizations, from civil societies, but also internationally, that kind of public interest mounts pressure, 1, on the government, and 2, on the judiciary, because it's also now a matter of also saving face. Remember, as you said, this is not the first time Pastor Paul Mackenzie is being arrested. He has been arrested before because of illegally having film without any licenses that were meant to indoctrinate and to radicalize his people. And these are some of the instances that he's been arrested for before. So he's not a new offender. So therefore, at this point, that pressure is what I believe, is being mounted on the investigation officers to ensure that they get to collect whatever evidence they can at this point and make that case watertight. Also to the government, because the religious leaders and people have come out to castigate them. How did this escape your eye? The Interior Cabinet Secretary says that Pastor Paul Mackenzie was on their radar since 2017. So how then did they not see whatever he was doing within that forest? I mean, after the report that was made, he set up another church and he had these people who were following him. Why is it that there was no follow-up that was made at that point? And therefore, personally, from where I sit, that public interest will really do justice at this point. And it's now upon the investigating officers to actually do their part, because the court will rely on the burden of proof, really. If that burden of proof is not provided, then unfortunately he gets to go scot-free. But because of the kind of numbers and the kind of the number of lives that have been lost at this point, this now makes it a serious issue, more serious than the other cases he had been arrested for earlier on.
Oh, wow. There's just so much to unpack with the whole of it, from the government's perspective, from the people of Kenya, and from Pastor Paul, the church even. There's so much, that needs to be unpacked. But we'll bring you in again, Raquel. Thanks very much for your time. And we look forward to speaking with you again.
Thanks, Olive and Shariji. Have yourselves a good day.
You as well.